Okay, good evening. I think we'll go ahead and begin. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. My name is Dan Olson. I'm the superintendent for the Monona Grove School District. And what we'd like to do tonight is have a short presentation to give you an update on the work that we've done up to this point, and then make sure we have plenty of time for question and answer. Afterwards as well, I'll stick around for individual conversations also when that concludes. So again, looking at our goals for this evening, we want to make sure that we talk through the process that we've had up to this point in our facilities planning work. Talk about the recommendations at this point from our Facilities Advisory Committee, the potential tax impact on those recommendations, and then next steps. And as I mentioned, then we want to have the Q&A. So before we get into the presentation, we do have a number of individuals that are with us tonight that will be helping present as well as being able to answer questions for us. They have their name tags at the table, but we'll let them introduce themselves and what their role is in this process.
Good evening. My name is Jared Rosing. I'm the Director of Business Services with the school district.
Hi, Bob Weigert from Epstein Union Architects. I'm an architecture with the firm and also a leader with our educational department.
I'm Peter Sainin. I'm a project manager with Findorf.
I'm Dan Eckberg. I work at Van Wall Associates, and we worked on the enrollment projections for the district.
I'm Jeff Carr. I'm the Facilities and Safety Supervisor for the district.
I'm Jason McCutcheon, and I was on the Facilities Committee.
Thank you all. We actually have a couple other of our committee members that will be joining us hopefully tonight as well to be part of the Q&A a little bit later, Patty Parrott and Joe Miller. Okay, so I'm going to just kick us off and talk about the background and the timeline of what got us to this point tonight before we get into the specifics of the work that has actually been done. This timeline is kind of hard to read this. We'll go through these kind of one at a time. But this is the facilities planning timeline and the work that has led up to this point, starting back actually in December of 2014. So at that time, as we looked at our facilities, the first thing that we had done was our initial enrollment projection. So we hired Vanderwall and Associates to look at putting together an enrollment projection. We'll talk a little bit more in detail in that, coming up. But essentially, historically for the district, most districts will do two things in trying to do enrollment projections. One is hiring a firm such as Vanderwall, who does that kind of work with their urban and suburban planning. And then there's also the Applied Population Lab from UW-Madison, where they take a little bit different approach looking at demographics, birth rates, and so on. And historically, this district has had regular updates from the Applied Population Lab. At that time, we thought we wanted to get a different approach as well, where they will get into looking much more at the development and how that might affect, as the rates as well. So that initial study was conducted back in 2014. Then concurrently, or right after we had the enrollment study, we wanted to do certainly the study of our actual facilities. And so we hired 3 firms to work with us: Epstein Union Architects, C.G. Schmidt Construction, and McKinstry as a consulting engineer with energy efficient projects and so on. And they took the approach and really did the full analysis of our buildings, looked at building capacities. And that's something we spent a lot of time on. You'd think it'd be pretty straightforward to say what a capacity is of a school building. But there's actually several different approaches depending on how you utilize the classrooms and so on. And so we spent some time to really look at what are the optimal capacities and space and so on moving forward. So that work was done in January through June of 2015. Concurrent to that work, by the study of the facilities, we put together a long-range facilities planning committee to take a look at the work that those consultants were doing and look at some initial observations, recommendations, and so forth. Okay, and so they looked at those studies, and that group was made up of a number of school board members and community members, staff members that did that initial work. And so that group concluded in July of 2015 with some preliminary recommendations in this phase 1 of the planning. And ultimately, that planning moved forward to recommendations to let's do continued study with phase 2. Then we had a break in the formal study of the facilities in the spring of 2016. Because as we received that recommendation, that preliminary recommendation and report in July of 2015, that fall, then we received information about our next 2-year state budget, okay? And that turned out to be not such a great budget for schools, and so we shifted focus as we prepared our budget into that fall. It was determined that we were going to seek an operational referendum to fund our normal, general fund operations of the schools. And so as the board and administration shifted our focus to that referendum, the facilities work continued on with our staff, but we didn't have a formal committee continuing to meet at that time. Okay, and just, and Jerry will speak a little bit more about the operational referendum and where that fits into facilities and so on. But just as a reminder, that was from day-to-day operations. That was not to fund, facilities. Now with that, we certainly have a part of the budget for capital maintenance and so on. And part of that operational budget was to, operational referendum was to help increase some of those funds just for the normal projects that we need to do. But it was not certainly to do the comprehensive list of the things that were in the facility study. Like I said, we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Okay, so then as we wrapped up the operational referendum in the spring of 2016, moving on into the fall, as we started the school year, got our budget adopted for the next year, then we refocused back on, okay, let's pick up where we left off with the facilities work. So it had been 2+ years since we had the original enrollment study done, and so the first thing we did is had an update of that study. Now, what's not on the slide, in addition to Vanderwall going back and updating their numbers, we did actually have a second study done by the UW Applied Population Lab as well. And so those numbers were incorporated into the Vanderwall report. Essentially, after 2 years, the numbers were updated slightly. There weren't significant changes with that. And again, we'll talk more in detail, but in general, it was a long-range study to look at the long-range growth for the district. And the long-range growth for 20 years showed a range of anywhere from 1,000 to 2,000 additional students. Well, obviously, that's a very wide range. There's a lot of factors that will impact that, whether it's on the low end or high end. Economic factors, issues, with, the village faces in Cottage Grove. And then also looking at, even in Monona, what the enrollment patterns look like there as well. But again, we'll talk a little bit more about the specifics with that. So then, as we had the updated enrollment study, now it was time to, okay, let's look at phase 2 of those recommendations from the original group about, okay, what are the next steps in actually making some decisions moving forward. And so at that time, in the last fall of October 2017, the board authorized putting together a facilities advisory committee, and that, this time around, was completely a citizen group. All the citizen members from the original committee in 2015 were invited to come back again on the committee, plus a number of other individuals. And so we ended up with a group of 20 and tried to have, a representative group of our communities. There were equal number of residents from Cottage Grove and Monona, as well as tried to have equal representation, parents, non-parents, and so on. And so that group then met throughout this past school year, and with that, they analyzed those enrollment studies, the previous facilities study, and had updates on those as well, and ultimately made some preliminary recommendations to the board that they presented then in May. At that same time as those preliminary recommendations were presented to the board is when we had the community survey, where that was sent to every household in the district and to really test the recommendations of that committee to get feedback on those recommendations. And again, we'll talk about what those survey results said here in a little bit. Okay, so that's kind of the background of the big picture about the work that's been done, bringing us up to today. And so from this point, I'm going to hand it off to Jason McCutcheon to talk more specifically about the work of the Facilities Advisory Committee this past year.
So I'm going to talk about what the committee was charged with doing here first. So we were charged with basically continuing the work that had been done prior to that. So we went back and reviewed the data that they had discovered, the data that had been updated through the new enrollment projections, things along those lines, tax implications, a lot of just all kinds of information, school capacities, all of the stuff that goes into getting to this decision. So we looked at all of that. We were charged with getting a preliminary recommendation that could then be used for the survey. So we had to go through that process of coming up with a general scope of what we thought could be done for the building and for the district as a whole, and what needed to be done, from looking at the capital improvements that needed to be done, looking at the facilities themselves, looking at grade configuration, all of those different topics. And then we were charged with preparing a final advisory final advisory to the board in June. So we got through all of that stuff. I guess I should have moved that one further. All right. So sorry about that. So as this shows, we met 8 times over October through June to get through that. We had additional committee group meetings to prepare for the recommendation to the board, the wordsmithing that goes into that. So there were some of us that did some of that from time to time also. We did tour the facilities. Not everybody was able to, on the committee, was able to tour the facilities, but there were multiple opportunities for people that hadn't been in the schools for a while to get in, look at them, see what the administration was telling us that needed to be done or didn't need to be done, or how they might do something. Just lots of different, information that we had to gather as a group. We worked with all of these people up here to give us the information on what may or may not be needed, how it might look, the costs that go associated with it, the grade configurations. The administration came through with some recommendations. The previous facility committee had recommendations. So we talked through all of those different things. We went through and had 2 community updates to talk about the process and where we were at back in February. We were able to come up with our preliminary recommendation in early February, so that the board could then take that information and put it into the community survey that went out to everybody. Once we got the survey back, the committee was involved in hearing the presentation on that, and then we were able to make our final formal recommendation. And I'm actually going to skip to that one. So one of the key things here that the committee was worried about and looked at intensely was the projection for students in the district. Going back over the last 10 years and gaining 500 students, and with this new projection coming up with an additional 700 across the district, it's pretty clear to the committee as a whole that something needed to be done. Exactly what needed to be done was, somewhat for debate, but, as the committee worked through it, we came to a consensus that coming up with this present option is the most logical at this time, which led us, to the community survey. So putting together the recommendation of building a K-5 school to get the glacial drumlin, the needed relief that it needs, and then also allowing for additional growth at other buildings through over the course of time. So one of the purposes of our recommendation and getting that out was to allow the community to give feedback on what that recommendation was, test whether or not it might be a viable option to potentially go for a referendum, to look at other alternatives, to see what tolerance there was for costs associated with it. The committee, as it looked at it, when we first made our recommendation, we went through and we came up with a full-fledged recommendation doing all of the capital maintenance that need to be done and have been put off for years. We went through and preliminary recommended doing all of the athletic facility updates that need to be done in the district. We went through and tried to, kind of put through the recommendation of asking the biggest bang for a dollar. And we went a little high. We knew it wasn't going to come back or didn't expect it to come back as that was going to be the dollar amount that everybody would support, but we thought that was the best place to go at that given time. We had over 1,800 community members provide feedback through the survey. I believe that the plus or minus on that is 2% from the survey company, so it's a pretty good indicator. It was either 2 or 3, but so it's a good revelation for that. The survey results, they tell us that we should pursue a referendum with a 62% from the respondents in the district. They, tell us to look at a 3-5 school because that's right now where the need is at to relieve the middle school and the growing population with the elementary schools in Cottage Grove. So that's where we decided to go on that. It prioritized high maintenance projects for the district that have been just put off for years, things that need to be done, windows, roofs, AC units, all of those types of maintenance things that the district just hasn't been able to do over the last 5, 10, 15 years. And then it talked about the safety and security, especially at Winnequa being an important piece that needed to be done, and redesigning that entrance a little bit, making that more secure for the students. So I'll hand it off now to Jo, and she can go through a few other things. I'm a little slow on the slide, sorry.
All right. My name is Jo Oyama Miller, and I've been a longtime resident here in Monona. I put all my children through school and international students as well. And so I was pleased to be asked to be on the facilities committees. I've been on the previous 2 or 3 committees as well. Whoops. Let's see. So our final fact recommendations that came up within the board is that we recommended that in November 2018 facilities referendum in the amount of $57 million to fund the following: a new school on district-owned land in Cottage Grove for grades 3 to 5, 9 classrooms per grade level with the ability to expand, high-priority capital maintenance projects throughout the district, the reconstruction of a failing high school track, and then looking at the high-priority renovation projects at all of the existing schools. As Jason mentioned, the committee reviewed a lot of data and information. And as you can see in the next slide, that before the survey, these were some of our preliminary recommendations. An $87 million facilities referendum, $33.6 to $37.1 million for the new elementary school for grades 3 to 5, which would accommodate 10 classrooms per grade. $16.4 million in capital maintenance, which had been earlier identified as really necessary within the district and had been put off for many years. $14.8 million for outdoor athletic facilities throughout our district, and $20.4 million in renovations to existing schools. After the survey and from those recommendations that the survey company could show us, is that it was clear that the community would be willing to support a $57 million referendum. What did that mean? That instead of a $33.6 million school, we would now be looking at a $30.4 to $33.5 million elementary school for grades 3 to 5, 9 classrooms per grade. Core spaces would be sized for expansion. $14.8 million in capital maintenance. $585,000 to $645,000 to reconstruct the failing high school track, and $8 to $11.2 million in those high priority renovations, but that we would have no more than a $57 million total, and that the board and the administration would prioritize those projects. What is the rationale? Why November 2018? We know that we have projected overcapacity in 3 of our 5 buildings in the next 5 years. Increasing construction and financing costs, additional deferred maintenance costs, strain on the students and staff due to the overcrowding, and deteriorating buildings. Why $57 million? The survey indicates very strong community support at the $57 million. In fact, 62% of all of our respondents, and nearly half of all our non-parents and non-staff. Another rationale, why would we have a new elementary school for grades 3 to 5 in Cottage Grove? Because it would provide long-term 4K to 8 capacity in an area of district with rapid enrollment growth. It would relieve overcapacity at Drumlin Middle School. The ability to place Drumlin Middle School 5th graders in an elementary setting, aligning with Winterquist School. And it was a financially responsible solution. We spent a lot of time looking at and analyzing and being very thoughtful about each of these rationales. Why renovate the existing schools? The district has identified $20.4 million in needed renovations at existing facilities. Ability to construct a controlled entrance at Winterquist School. The opportunity to improve learning environments at all of our district learning schools. Expand the seating and functionality of the undersized GDS cafeteria, and the need to prioritize. The full $20.4 million cannot be accomplished under this $57 million referendum. Another rationale was, why address the capital maintenance? We need to maintain our existing facilities to ensure that we maximize their lifespan. $14.8 million in district-wide high-priority maintenance items have been identified for us. And then lastly, why reconstruct the high school track? The high school track is in disrepair and needs full reconstruction to remain usable and safe. FAC, the committee, initially recommended $14.8 million in potential outdoor athletic facilities, but it came down that the administration advised that the high school track should be our highest priority. And then I'd like to turn it over to Jared so that he can give you more information on the estimated tax impact.
Good evening. As I had mentioned before, my name is Jared Rosing. I'm the Director of Business Services. And I get to talk a little bit about what we anticipate for an estimated tax impact here. Unfortunately, to bring on a new building, we can't build it for free or build it within our budget. So we need to talk about what does that look like. So when we look at if the board passed a resolution to build a new school that costs, in all the projects, $57 million, we would need to come to the voters and ask 2 questions on the ballot. The first one would be a facilities referendum, which then the voters would authorize the school district to purchase and sell bonds, which is very similar to a mortgage that we would have when you go to build your house. And that's what actually we would be paying off the building. We structure that around a 20-year loan or a borrowing timeline, and that's really wrapped around what our current debt schedule looks like. So our current debt schedule, so with all of our buildings that we've done and we've passed referendums, not the one that we did in April of 2016, the last payment that we have is in 2026. So part of the reason that we are coming forth is obviously there's a need, but as we sort of plan out this, we were able to wrap that around our existing debts. The second question that we would need to be able to ask the voters is the operational referendum. So the operational referendum would be very similar to the operational referendum that we did ask in April of 2016. The difference would be is this allows the district to hire and pay for bringing on a new school. So our previous referendum was for us to continue to keep class sizes low, to continue to purchase equipment that we feel was needed to provide our students with a quality education, and to be able to fund some additional teacher compensation and staffing compensation sides of things. In addition to that, we've talked about having a $14.8 million deferred capital maintenance plan. Part of the reason that $14 million is there is that our previous budget had about $200,000 that was allocated out of a $33 million budget to put into annual upkeep of a building. Well, as we all know as homeowners, that's a pretty small percentage, and if we could able to maintain our buildings at a high quality at that low percentage, that would be great. But what the problem is when we need to replace roofs, $200,000 doesn't cut it. And so when we asked for the operational referendum in April of 2016, we were able to increase our budget to $600,000, which has allowed us to keep chipping away at some of those projects. However, for example, some of the items that have been listed has been replacing all the original piping at Winnequa. That's original piping, which would cost us well over $2 million. Well, at a $600,000 budget, that's would take a lot of years just to segment that. So part of the reason, so the operational referendum that would be on the ballot would be question number 2, would authorize the district to exceed our spending limits that are set by the state to open up a new building. And what do those costs look like? Those costs are obviously bringing on a new school would have utility costs with it. We would need to hire additional grounds and custodial staff in addition to administrative staff. The one thing that happens when we open up a new school, when we bring new students over, obviously we're bringing teachers and teaching staff with them. And so this referendum would not require us to purchase or hire additional staff. What it does is when those new students come on, the additional revenue that we're receiving from those students would help us pay for our additional teaching staff. So the first tax impact here would be of a $57 million referendum. So what we have to do here is we have to look over the life of 20 years, and we have to make a lot of assumptions. That we're taking a 20-year borrowing, we're looking at a 4% interest rate, and right now we're looking at a 2% property valuation. That 2% property valuation is fairly low, but we want to stay on the conservative side. So when, if the referendum is successful, that there are not large surprises when it comes to tax bills. So for a $57 million facility referendum over 20 years, we'd be looking at an existing 29 cents per $1,000 of property value. So the easiest way to do that is to take your property value divided by 1,000 and then multiply that by 29 cents. So if you had a property value of approximately $300,000, that annual increase to your taxes would be $87 per year. And that would be over 20 years. After that debt has been paid off, that tax impact would go away. For example, when we start continuing to pay off our buildings, each year we see debt falling off, which isn't allowing the district to go back and re-tax for that. It just falls off the debt schedule and allows the mill rate to decrease. It does become pretty tricky because when we talk about this, we're talking about mill rates. So if your property values or your valuation increases, but we have no new houses coming online, we're not really just changing the way that what's all we're doing is we're really lowering the mill rate. No one else is necessarily picking up a small portion of the pie. The second question, as I had talked about, would be an operational referendum. So right now, and to keep, we've identified a range of $840,000 to $930,000 to open up a new 3-5 building. That would give us a 42 cents to 46 cents per $1,000 of property value. And just like the other one, if you take your property value and you divide it by 1,000 and multiply it by that range, you would get this dollar amount. You'll see here that a $300,000 property value is about $126 to $138 annually. The difference between this and the previous referendum for our facilities is that this is reoccurring. So this continues to stay off. It doesn't necessarily fall off our tax bill. This number doesn't get adjusted if we receive more or additional state aid. And then I'll turn it over to Superintendent Olson for next steps.
Okay, so what happens, from here? The board has received the recommendation from the Facilities Advisory Committee. And at this point, they've had one meeting where they've had an opportunity for some initial discussion. And then they will be discussing this over the next month and ultimately making a decision whether or not to accept the recommendation, modify it, or come up with whatever plan that they choose to do. So some of the key considerations of our school board, okay, as they do that deliberation over this next month or two. Certainly, the first question, of course, is whether or not to accept the recommendation to actually go to referendum. If so, the amount, the timing, okay, of the referendum, and then, of course, the scope of the project. Some other things that they will be tackling as well, or continuing to discuss, grade configuration, and I'll talk a little bit about that here in a minute. Of the existing or the remaining buildings. The renovation priorities, as we mentioned, there's many items that were identified. We have some preliminary recommendations for the board to consider, but a lot of work needs to do yet to determine those exact priorities. And then, of course, these operating costs that Jared just spoke of to determine is that the number that they're comfortable with or a different number, as well. And so if they do choose to adopt a resolution for a fall, a November referendum, August 27th is the deadline statutorily for them to make that decision. Okay, so really there'll be some sort of decision between now and August 27th with regard to whether or not there'll be a fall referendum. So since the last time that we've got together, now I didn't mention it, but many of you were in attendance, we had some community updates back in February. Since that time, of course, we've had the community survey. The committee's updated the recommendation, as we've talked about. But there's been a few general questions that repeatedly have come up from a number of individuals. So I'd like to just touch on a couple FAQs tonight. So first, with regard to the grade configuration. Now, this is the chart that we've had out, before. But if the board accepts the recommendation to move forward with a referendum for a new elementary school for grades 3 through 5, then there's a decision to make with the two remaining elementary schools, Taylor Prairie School and Cottage Grove School. Traditionally, this district has generally not had attendance boundaries within a community, that students stay together and move from one building to the other, all in the same grade. And so that would be the option one, and that was the initial preferred option of our committee, to kind of stay with the status quo. That does create challenges because that is one more additional transition for kids. And so the discussion was about the pros and cons of having those additional transitions, or is now the time to consider setting some attendance areas just for the 4K through 2 so that students could stay in the same school a little bit longer. So those are some of the considerations that the board will be discussing and ultimately, making a decision. If we are to go to referendum for a school, I think it's important that the community knows the entire plan about what would happen through existing schools as well. The board has had a lot of discussion on that over the past 3 years. When this initial study started back in 2015, as they did their work, the board, immediately looked at the possible, grade configurations of the different plans that are out there. So it's not like it's new information just being brought forward now. Ultimately now a final decision, though, needs to be made with regard to that. I will say that this particular option 2 is a little bit different than ones that were previously reviewed, but it has the same considerations. There's certainly challenges by putting attendance boundaries in to deal with. So those will be in the decision making. Of course, the input from our Facilities Advisory Committee. There is a question on the community survey, and of course, there's a lot of input that we'll bring forth from our staff and other areas. Okay, second question has come up is the idea as we look at long range growth and knowing that high school has a certain capacity as well, was that ever a consideration on the table to perhaps look at a new high school to accommodate future capacity? And then, of course, the other buildings, the current buildings, could be repurposed elsewhere. And so initially, the 2015 committee did look at all schools K through 12 and looked at the projected enrollment, the capacity of each, and with their recommendation after that first year of study was part of their recommendation is to leave the high school at the current site and look for K-8 solutions moving forward. So based upon that preliminary recommendation, the updated enrollment studies, when the new Facilities Advisory Committee convened this past year, their focus was on the 4K through 8 solutions. And then part of that recommendation, of course, is continue to monitor the growth at the high school, for the future. The big thing when we talk about enrollment, again, being those projections, we know the growth is coming. The big question, of course, when is something we have to monitor continually as to, we don't know exactly when they'll reach those capacities. So with that, because that was a question of some interest, we have this past month put some time into to actually do some preliminary costing of what a high school would cost. Okay, and this is on your handout. And without having part of the committee's work, we had to obviously make some assumptions about, well, if you were to build a new high school, how big would you build it? Right now, our enrollment is just over 1,000 at the high school. Our capacity is a little bit over, approaching 1,300. So we use 1,600, as a potential size of a new school. And with that, to have the same things that we have right now, a pool, auditorium, and the athletic facilities and so on. So that approximate cost would be about $110 million for all-inclusive of all the things that you would need at a high school. Now, the cost that we don't have determined at this time, but would need to be included, additional land for a new high school, typically for a school that size, and those features, you'd need about 60 acres. Currently, the district owns 40 acres of buildable property. And then, of course, the existing high school and middle school would need to be converted. There'd be some costs associated with converting those to different grade level buildings. So we have the land costs, conversion costs, and then we still have the same other outstanding issues that we're dealing with right now with the capital maintenance needs and, of course, the renovations in the existing schools. So again, without being definitive, at least this gives you an idea of what type of costs are associated with building a high school. Obviously much more expensive than with an elementary. Okay, and then back to the question of why in November of 2018. Joe addressed this in part of her presentation, and so I think a lot of this is some of the same bullet points. But the other thing I'd like to add about the timing and related back to the operational referendum of 2016. Okay, if you recall, that operational referendum was for 5 years. So it's to exceed the revenue limits by $2.6 million for the next 5 years. So in 2021, that will expire. Now, we don't know what's going to happen with the state budget between now and then, but if things essentially stay the same, there'd be a high likelihood that we would come back and ask to renew that. Now, in renewing, that does not mean a tax increase. If you renew for the same 2.6, it means status quo, taxing at the same level that we're at now. But nonetheless, it does require another referendum. And so that's one of the other things to keep in mind, that as we look at facilities, we still do have that looming ahead, in 2.5 years as well, that something will have to be addressed. And so I don't know that that was really a consideration of the committee to say, well, we have to do it now before that operational comes up. But it's just something we should be aware of, that doesn't go away. But I think the rationale that the committee came forth was essentially based upon the needs of those three schools, excuse me, reaching capacity here in the next 5 years. Okay, so that is the information portion that we like to present. And so we wanted to make sure we had a lot of time for question and answer tonight. So the format that we'd like to have, we've got a number of individuals between our we have 3 members of our panel that were on the Facilities Advisory Committee. We also have a number of other individuals that are here with us tonight that are on that Facilities Advisory Committee as well. So certainly we want to give those individuals an opportunity to, chime in and offer any insights as well during the Q&A portion. And then as well with our experts at the other table, we should be able to answer questions of any detail that you might have with regard to specifics of the plan, of the process, and so on. Now, the other thing I'd like to point out is we do have the majority, if not all, of our school board members present tonight as well. Okay, so it's an opportunity for them to listen, hear the questions and comments that you all have tonight. And then after we get through the formal Q&A, we'll all stick around as well for any individual conversations that you'd like to have as follow-ups. We will make sure that no one leaves tonight without having all your questions answered, moving forward, and be perfectly clear about where we're at in the process and decision-making process and so on. Okay, the other thing I'd like to point out, of course, we are live streaming, and we'll have this the video available. So when you ask your questions, even though it's a small room, we would like you to use the microphone so we can get them recorded so that everyone can hear the questions. And so I'm going to pass around the mic. I will help monitor, and then you'll direct the answer to the appropriate person that can answer with that. So with this, do I have some help with the mic?
Just raise your hand if you have questions. I have a question about the athletic facilities specifically, and the kind of, I guess, pretty drastic reduction from the first to the last. My husband and I are kind of speaking on behalf of the high school soccer team. It's been an identified need for several years. I mean, currently the facilities that we have, it's not a dedicated soccer field. It's a football field that we use for soccer, and we are not allowed to hold regional and sectional competitions on that field. Yeah, WIAA real. So we see this as a basic essential to high school athletics, that you provide facilities that is a basic requirement per the WIAA requirements. So I guess I definitely support, I've always supported the school referendums, but we're just disappointed to see the drastic reduction. And I don't know if there could be separate questions on the referendum, or why it was identified as only 2 in operating in facilities, or could there have been the option to include some more athletic facilities in the referendum?
Okay, thank you for your question.
Hi, I'll answer that. Patty Parrott, I was a member of the Facilities Advisory Committee. I think the committee absolutely shares your concern. We talked a lot about that, but, and both of my kids are young, but very active in Monona Grove Soccer Club as well. But at the end of the day, when we got the feedback in terms of what amount of money the community would support, being at $57 million, that's when it came down to the difficult choice of starting to prioritize. And as a committee, we felt that we obviously absolutely had to get the elementary school in, because that was the area of greatest need. So that took up the $30 to $32 million chunk. We absolutely felt the need to get those high maintenance issues done, such as the roof and some of the light renovations. So unfortunately, when we started adding that up, we were left with a pretty minimal amount of money when it came to athletics. And so we deferred to the administration and to the activities director and asked them what their recommendation was, and the track is what came back at the highest area of need. It's certainly something the committee talked about. We felt it was important, but at the end of the day, when we prioritized, it was one of those things that had to fall off.
Also, in other communities who have had to face similar things, is that oftentimes the school boards and districts go back to that community and say, how else can we fund those? What can we do? So it may come back within the communities to be able to say, let's start a fund drive. Let's, do you have donations put in? Do you have a bequest? Whatever it is. It isn't meaning that it's not going to get done ever. It's just that at this point in time with the referendum, if we could find more community support coming back from additional meetings like this, and people said, wait, I'm willing to pay more of my taxes, that I think that and we hear enough and the school board hears enough, those are some of the considerations communities always have to listen to. And, it means that folks like you who want anything specifically done have to really go out, find your focus, find your group, and come back and give the school board and the administration and say, hey, we have half the funding, can we find it somewhere else? Hopefully, maybe some of our costs that our professionals come back in, we come under, and we might have additional monies. I know when we did the MATC building, we found out because of the timing of and the strong financial environment, we were able to add additional things. Now, is that going to be true now? I don't know. Those are the questions that the professionals can ask them.
Dan, you might also mention we can only ask 2 questions a year.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, the state statutes have changed recently. So now, yeah, there are only, when you go to referendum, you are only allowed to ask 2 questions. And so if we have referendum, it'd be 1 on facilities and 1 on operations. We no longer can ask multiple questions about different, projects. I guess the last thing I will add is absolutely, we all share that same concern, and I know that will be a part of the board discussion of if ultimately the soccer field, as well as some of the other athletic facilities, are not part of the referendum, the discussion's got to be, well, then is there another way that we can still, those needs don't go away? And so are there ways of funding elsewhere, whether it be through private donations or in the general operating budget as well? Is that something that we can plan for? So as we mentioned, in that original recommendation, there were identified $87 million worth of needs. And so those things are still there, and we need to come up with a plan for those as well.
Just a reminder, state your name and your place. It's really important for us to know, as well as the school board, where you're located in the petitions for those who are listening.
Okay.
All right. Randy Becker. I'm actually the boys soccer coach and wrestling coach at Monona Grove. 2 questions. One would be what are the board's plans? Let's say the school comes in at $29 million. Will you guys have like projections to say, hey, we have approved of $57 million, we can take this $4 million. How will you prioritize where that money will go, whether it's athletic or other aspects? Second thing, I know sponsorships is kind of frowned on. Will the school board or administration change that to allow possible fundraising for facilities for the district? That could be a great revenue generator. There's a lot of businesses in the communities that would probably be for that, but with the limitation of sponsorships, it's frowned upon. So.
Okay. I'll answer the second question first, and then if any of the board members perhaps want to chime in. With regard to sponsorships or private fundraising, there's nothing in policy prohibiting it right now. And I will say we absolutely be having that discussion moving forward about, is that a viable option? We've had some preliminary discussions at the committee level, so I'm certain that we'll be talking about that. With regard to the first question, what if some of the things come in at a lower cost? Part of the process, when the board goes through to prioritize those projects, there absolutely will be a final list of priority 1 and then a secondary piece that can move in if costs allow. So that will be part of the project, not just to set everything else aside, but to have that secondary priorities as well.
Thank you, and I'd really like to thank the Facilities Committee. I know everybody put a lot of work into it, and it's easy for us to criticize. My butt's going to come. But so I just wanted to first say thank you for all your time. I'm really disappointed about the answer on the facilities, though, and because I say, well, Verona just passed a $181 million referendum. So when I've got 4 kids, 6101 Gateway Green, Monona. My name's Robert Proctor. I have a daughter at Glacial Drumlin and 3 at Winnequa. So as I'm looking, why would I want to stay in the Monona Grove district if I can move to Verona and get their facilities? And I can find a house comparable price. And that's what I think a lot of people will be facing. And if we can't pass an $87 million referendum, and then 5-6 years from now, we're going to have to deal with the high school, and we can't even deal with the athletic facilities now, I see it as being, okay, so we had an 18, so I'll get to my question. So one 1,800 person survey has convinced us that we shouldn't fix our problems. When it seems like we should have gone out, educated everybody as to what we need in order to be facilities that are comparable to all our neighboring school districts, and then done a survey and said, are you willing to do this because we've educated you as to the facilities. The entire education they got was the 10 questions on the survey. And so to me, that's not really a response to say, well, yeah, if you give us 10 questions, we're willing to do 57 million. And so so my question is I would like to see more put into educating the people and going back to see if we can get something more, because I see this as just a Band-Aid and really trying to help.
Much of what you said sounds great and common sense. From the facilities committee is that we received this data, we looked at it. We asked that the school board be able to put it up on the school board, that it was presented out to each of the communities in the district. It was listed, as I was told, through newsletters and things like that. We, 20 people in the committee, cannot make our community read and be as involved as we are. We understand that. We tried to go through listening sessions to be able to do it. The survey, what it tells us is if we go out and we raise and ask for a $110 million or $180 million survey, it would be voted down. If it's voted down, all right, the second time surveys are to go out and to ask for a referendum is much harder to be able to do that. So one of the question is that if you believe right now at the community level that this referendum is too low, then you better be talking to your school board. You should be talking to, because now they're the ones that have to make the decision. And if you could prove or show data and information that there is a community that will take 187 million, we as a board, committee, we're even concerned about 87 million, because we know what's also coming down the line for each of our communities. So we have to take the whole community. In Monona, we have a lot of referendums coming for our community to make it a better living places. Police, fire, parks. So how can we choose all of these things in such a way that we make the best viable community affordable for everybody living in the community? Because at one point, you're right, we're going to tax people out and we're going to be left with something else. Or those left behind are going to be very pleased with what we get because it's been a community input. And this is my third facilities. And one of the things that I asked on the facilities is that we have the ability to expand our buildings and our facility needs in terms of land, because all the other times we didn't have that option. We didn't have an extra 10 feet in Taylor Prairie to make another classroom, or to change the way the glacial drumming is because of the way the construction was. So I think we understand that, and we can't all be Veronas and we can't be Oregons unless there are people out there that will really come out and say, go for the $120 million referendum. Our school board and I personally don't believe that our community would support that.
I just want to add in, I thank you for the support of the community, and I agree. I think what drove a lot of the work of the committee was the sense of urgency as we looked at those enrollment numbers. So where we'd like to take a lot more time to really get groundswell activity to get more support for the athletics program, we found a real sense of urgency in terms of 3 of our buildings are going to be over capacity at the elementary level in 5 years. So if we spend a year or two trying to drum up support for more athletics programs or more facilities, I think that we're running the risk of doing our children a real disservice, because the immediate need is the immediate need is space to educate our children at the elementary level. We have to take care of that immediately, and as the slide said, that's a big reason why we asked for the school board to consider referendum in November, because we feel as though the time is now to get that done. But again, I'm really appreciative of your energy around that, and to build on Joe's point, if that's something this community feels is important, then we need to do that. We need to talk to our neighbors, we need to build groundswell, and we need to gain support, and then we need to take that back to the school board. But our real problem, what really drove this committee, was the enrollment numbers at the elementary level, and so we feel like the action has to be taken immediately to solve that problem.
Rhonda Goodrow, Cottage Grove. We totally. I'm not going to say. Rhonda Goodrow, Cottage Grove. A couple.
Rhonda, hang on 1 second. Sorry, Rhonda. I just want to say, not dismissing anything you said, because I understand what you're saying, but the comparison to Verona isn't really fair, because they had a $181 million referendum, and almost all of that was EPIC money. So they're
140 million.
140 of that was EPIC money. So it's really their taxes go up, right, barely, but hardly any at all. It's a $40 million referendum for a bigger city. I mean, it's just right. Right, right. Yeah, right, right. But we can't offer EPIC.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so a couple of things. I think that everybody acknowledges there's obviously been a lot of work done. We're just trying we are doing the very thing you're asking us to do. We're coming to the school board and we're now expressing our concerns and are trying to open up debate, because we think some things may have been missed in the initial process. We understand that there was an urgent fix, but it was the entire process was predetermined. Ultimately, we're going to go for a 3 to 5 grade fix. That's where we're going to go. And so everything kind of was skewed in that way. And granted, it was what was the most immediate need, what was the most immediate fix, but you're going to come back. We're going to have to come back to address a problem. We're going to have a 20-year loan that won't fix a problem, okay, that's going to happen before the 20 years is up. Makes no sense. So it's all how you phrase. Agreed. People don't want to put extra money out of their pocket, but you haven't looked at revenue. It's all about cost. If you phrase a survey in a way that says it's going to cost you $10 or $15, which do you want? People will say $10. But if you phrase a survey that says, but our $15 fix will actually generate revenue to the community, which when we're proposing looking at the high school option, and a high school option that allows competition, that meets the regulations so that we can have regional competitions, the money that gets fed into our community, I think that you've already kind of preset that no one's going to accept more money, so we have to kind of dumb down our solution in order for the community to accept it. And what we're saying is there might be another way to elevate the community in terms of considering the long-range prospects for building this community, as well as some additional higher expense initially, but what comes back could be triple. So I think we need to kind of just, we want you to revisit this. We want you to, we do think it was a little skewed, and we understand the reasoning. There was an immediate fix, there was a concern on cost, but we don't think the survey or any of the process considered the full package, which was also what the revenue potential was for the community and growth.
Rhonda, can I ask a clarifying question on that, please? Just to clarify, you said that the decision to build a 3 to 5 school was preset. What are you basing that? I'm not clear on that, where that came from. Are you saying because that came out of the initial long-range planning committee meeting, or?
In the presentation this evening, they said that the committee looked at a lot of different options, but that really in the end, they decided to go for a fix to address an immediate need, and that was from one of the gentlemen that spoke, which we understand. It was driven to fix an immediate need, which you're all saying the elementary, that's our most critical need. And I think that drove us away from seeing the bigger picture. I think we can accomplish an immediate need and a long-range need, and one doesn't preclude the other from being accomplished. That's all.
I'll answer a little bit of that in that our charge was specifically to look at 4K to 8. So you are correct in that we didn't, while we discussed the high school, we discussed the enrollment projections as it relates to the high school for the next 20 years. We looked at what the impact was going to be. We talked about whether some additions could be done at the current high school that could get us through the 20 years that we looked at for those projections. The charge of the committee was 4K through 8. So but we did look at both.
I just wanted to first thank everybody for coming here tonight. I'm really pleased to see lots of new faces. My name is Ryan Ullman, and I'm a community member with 3 children that are in the district. I became aware of the referendum through the survey, so thank you for sending the survey. Since then, my husband and I have sought out all opportunities to understand the FAC updates, the facility planning timeline that is underway, our school district including school board meetings, the FAC proposal meeting, the MGSD website, Dan Olson and Jared Rothstein community meeting, village meetings, as well as several community update meetings held by citizens of the communities. I personally have asked for this public forum to give the community an opportunity to ask questions following the survey, and thank you for following through with scheduling this meeting. In the essence of time, I decided to touch on one particular topic. The topic I'd like to understand more detail is the survey process and the steps that took place in our district's planning of the survey. To my knowledge, the FAC committee was given the scope of K through 8 focus, and by whom is a question. To my knowledge, I understand the recommendation of the survey was given by the FAC committee. Is that correct? To my knowledge, the FAC committee, looking to gauge interest of the community, didn't participate in the survey creation, correct? What parties were involved in the survey creation? I had on here, could you disclose the response rate of the survey, and I heard that this evening of 2%. How was the audience identification decided? Were there direct target audiences such as teachers, faculty, extracurricular teachers, coaches who operate the facilities who live outside the district included? And if so, how did you ensure and confirm this in your survey process? Was there communication to the community to expect a survey? If so, what were the communication channels used? In my line of work, I have experience in survey audience identification, survey effects, and survey analysis. I appreciate the survey being considered and implemented. The number one reason businesses, nonprofits, education sectors use a survey is to base decisions on objective information. Conducting surveys in an unbiased approach in decision making, it helps to broaden the capability and draw conclusions. Where I professionally see an opportunity for improvement in survey process conducted earlier this year, consider all audiences to gain objective information with a larger scope of information. Pilot the questionnaire. Soft launch the survey with audiences that have experience in our district on a daily or more frequent basis first. This allows further discovery of needs, ideas, and solutions. It can certainly help to restructure the survey based on a soft launch to avoid leading questions, assuming prior knowledge or understanding, asking 2 questions in one, and inadequate response options. I would recommend multiple surveys to gather a full picture of information by including short-term needs and long-term needs from the start in a multiple survey approach. You can save time and gather data for long-range plan moving forward much easier. At this time, I would recommend an additional survey go out. And I'd also like to add that I am for a smart, long-term decision with smart spending. I would vote way more than $57 million.
Okay, I'll take, you had a number of questions. I didn't get a chance to write them down. I'll try to answer most of those, and I'm sure we have others to make sure that we can answer. So a little bit about the survey process. When the FAC concluded their recommendations, As far as the notification about the survey coming out, there was a postcard mailer that went to all residents, informing residents about the community update meetings, as well as that the survey would be forthcoming as well. So the role of the FAC was to come forth with recommendations. From there, based upon those, the initial draft of the survey was done by our administrative team and consultants with the consultant from School Perceptions, is the survey, the consulting firm that wrote or administered the survey for us. We took an initial draft based upon what we felt were the questions from the FAC recommendation, and then we took it to the school board. And so the school board had an opportunity to meet with the survey consultant as well to refine it, to make sure the questions were being asked that they wanted, to hear as well within the scope of that recommendation. So that was the process of developing the survey. I'm certainly not an expert in survey, tools. The firm that we hired, School Perceptions, specializes just with school districts, and so they've done surveys with I believe well over 200 school districts in Wisconsin, and so I won't get into the whole piece that they could answer as far as reliability of the data and so on. But in any case, that was the process in developing the survey. I'm sure there are a couple other questions in there you asked that I missed. Response rate. The response rate was actually about 20% of all people that had received the survey. The margin of error was 2%. Right. Okay.
Yeah, who decided to only focus on K through 8? Who gave that information to the current FAC committee?
That was the original long-range facilities planning committee. When they looked at the K-12, looked at their initial enrollment projections, and the recommendation to the board from that initial committee was moving forward to come up with a plan to address K-8 enrollment.
And to be clear, that timeline was 2015, correct? That was conducted?
Correct. And then from there, based upon that recommendation, as well as I mentioned that we had a kind of that hiatus, of 9 months without a committee working while we were doing the operational referendum. In the meantime, the school board certainly was continuing to get updates, and it was certainly on part of their discussions. And so then ultimately the board crafted the charge for the committee, but it was based upon that initial committee. Katie.
Jared, is it possible to put up the district survey or the enrollment information on the projection that's on the screen that's being used? So in the long-range growth study, there's numbers that were used, the average, the low-end, high-end average. So it's on the district site. Can we just pull that up? There's a discrepancy that I just want to talk about. So as Jared pulls that up, my name is Ryan Hummer. I have 3 kids in the district, 1, 8, and 11. I'm also a graduate of Monona Grove High School and a business owner within the community. First off, I fully support the need to address the enrollment capacities within the district. Jason, Joe, Patty, thank you for coming tonight. I know it's not always easy to field these questions, and Dan, thank you for having us. The projections that are being used in regards to 4K. So we have off-site 4K facilities out of Taylor Prairie, and in there's 78 resident students. Why are we not considering them in our projection totals?
So on one of the charts, 4K is not in there. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so the starting point is only what's in Taylor Prairie, and not the 78 resident students. So if we're just using resident only.
Yeah.
What was the basis behind that decision?
Okay, and perhaps Dan can answer a little bit more specifically with regard to the projections. But I can tell you this: a little bit about 4K. Certainly 4K is still an optional program, so not all students participate. So right now, we're usually between 80 and 90% of 4-year-olds in the district actually participate in 4K. So that's not always the best, indicator necessarily, moving forward. That varies every year about how many actually follow through to 5K the next year. And then with regard to and again, because of the community sites that we have, we do take a larger number of open enrollment 4K students every year, because historically we found a trend that a number of those do not continue on in our district. It's out of convenience, childcare, and so on. And so the data for the 4K is a little bit different than what we have for the others, but we do try to track the number of 4-year-olds that reside in the district. We do a pretty good job with our census counts, but we don't really know for sure until they enter 5-year-old kindergarten.
And then Winnequa. So and this may be a question for Dan here. When you look at the low end, high end, the results are the same across the board. Okay, so it doesn't matter whether it's the average, low end, high end. Why is that?
Yep. The reason that is because the low and high end were based on, the low end was based exclusively on official population projections from the Wisconsin Department of Administration for Cottage Grove. We did not use those projections from Monona because DOA, as of today even still, projects that the city of Monona is going to lose another 1,000 people over the next 20 years. It has actually been doing the opposite. It's been growing. And so we just did not use those. So that was the low end projection for Cottage Grove. The high end projection for Cottage Grove was based on a hybrid of that official projection from the state. So that projection from the state breaks down projections into 2 types of growth. Growth from migration and growth from natural increase, so births and deaths. And when we dug down into the numbers, historically, they were under-projecting Dane County's migration growth going into the future. For the past, from 1990 to 2000 and from 2000 to 2010, Dane County as a whole gained about 30,000 people via migration. The DOA is projecting Dane County to gain only 6,000 people via migration, I think, in 2040. And so for the high-end number, we got rid of the migration numbers, based them on historic trends for Dane County for Cottage Grove, and also incorporated the natural increase numbers from the state. So if we had done a low end for Monona, it would just show like a very sharp decline.
Okay, and that's what I thought. In addition, just so I'm clear, the enrollment study is only based on new households, not turnover.
It is based on a number of factors, primarily new housing, but as Dan mentioned at the beginning, we built upon the projections done by the Applied Population Lab at UW. So they did projections first, which are based on recent trends, just purely on recent trend lines within the district, and also they incorporate the actual size of grade progressions that rolls over year to year. And then they also incorporate birth rates within both communities over the past 5 years to try and get a feel for how many students up through the next 5 years would be in like kindergarten and so forth. But yes, to answer your question, there is turnover in existing housing stock is not incorporated.
So we all are familiar with the Winnequa or the Monona community. And I do real estate sales professionally. There on average for the last 3 years, there's been about 100 homes sold in Monona. So again, if the data was all taken into consideration, my guess is that those homes are sold, they're turned over from an older population to a younger population that has families. Would that be a fair assumption to make?
What we've seen, there has been growth within Winnequa in the past couple of years, and it's likely based on that. And to the degree that that has already happened a little bit within the past 5 years in those young families have already moved in and had kids, it is accounted for based on the applied population looking at birth rates within Monona. To the degree that it has continued to happen, we don't know a way to incorporate that.
So, I mean, isn't that somewhat of a gap in information that says, you know, we're doing all these projections off of these our enrollments off of these projections, but it doesn't include new families to Monona. So that seems somewhat of a hole in the system. In addition, what we were told is that the low end, high end, the last column that's kind of cut off here, is what was used. Dan, is that what was used for the projections that were stated to the public?
So in 2015 with the original study, that committee was looking at the data in its entirety, the low and the high. And so our FAC this past year looked at it in its entirety, but then as far as determining what to publish, as you know, there's just so many numbers there. And so ultimately what was decided to publish was the average of the high-low and of resident students only, with the idea that we could control open enrollment.
Okay, so what wasn't corrected then was, if you look at this average, all of the information that was provided to the public was based on the average, except for Glacial Drumlin. So that 1190, that end number, isn't the column that was used. What was used for the public survey was the low end. So essentially, you surveyed the public with a school that had a different criteria in this information. So if you pull up the FAC recommendation, that's public information, in there's going to be a chart that is used that basically is somewhat misleading when it comes to enrollment projections. So this chart here, it's not using the right number for Glacial Drumlin. So I guess what I'm trying to say here is that that survey essentially was projecting numbers that were incorrect based on what was being used for the other properties. So the other thing is those totals on the bottom are wrong. The net changes, if you look at the high end, low end, they're not even in the middle of those. So the 2026-27, where it says 489 students, that's actually supposed to be 700 something students. So what I'm concerned about is I think that the way we looked at this enrollment, it does solve the Cottage Grove enrollment 4K to 5, but based on the projections, and if you look at Glacial Drumlin, if you take out, there's about 175 students from Cottage Grove in the 5th grade, which my son's in. If you take out 200 students and map this out on that average, we're going to be at capacity at Glacial Drumlin in 12 years. And if you do that based on with open enrollment, because we are accepting open enrollment 4K to 5 still in certain grade levels, that would put you at 9 years. In addition, there's been a lot of conversation about the high school would be at capacity of the 1256 in 11 years, and with open enrollment, obviously, it skews that number. So not using open enrolled students 4K to 5, plus the discrepancy with not using Monona's house turnover, is that really an accurate picture? I mean, that's what I'm concerned about, that we're not painting the most accurate picture for the enrollment.
If I could add at least about the discrepancy in the averages. The document I'm looking at, the published final document, does have those averages. I believe what you're describe, I think this must have been an older draft because the version I'm looking at does have the bottom line, like,
I'd just like to comment. I'm Peter Sobel. I've been on the board for quite some time now, and I've been looking at enrollment projections since we started doing that. And I have to say, all of these numbers are wrong because they're projections, right? And they can only give us an idea of what the trends are going to be. And it's impossible to say, well, this school is going to be full in 10 years or not. We've seen this before. We've seen the real problems with the projections in the past because of things that are outside of our control. You know, we had the economic downturn a few years ago, and growth in Cottage Grove slowed down dramatically, but we saw an increase in student growth in Monona, and it turned out that there were families moving back in with their parents, give us some growth. We've also seen some turnover that's been going on for the last several years that in Monona wasn't projected, and now I think it amounted to an additional 70 students, for example, in Winnequa. The problem is that we don't have a magic ball, a crystal ball. We can't see ahead, and it becomes we have to look at these ranges. If you ask me, the right number to look at is about 10 years out. Make sure that you have pretty good accommodation for 10 years out, because if you go much farther than that and things aren't what you predict, then you may have tied up a lot of taxpayer money that you're not using the most efficiently in the district. And this is just based on a long experience of seeing these enrollment projections being not because they're inadequately done, but because next year there's always something that comes up that's out of our control that changes everything, all the assumptions that goes into this.
Could I finish? Sure. All right, so the verbalized plan for the high school as of right now that's been expressed publicly is that we're going to add a 3-story addition with 9 to 15 classrooms for space for about 225 to 325 students. Is that a real possibility? Our current site is 21 acres, and as you can see, the recommendation for a high school facility is far greater, which the recommendation on the board here was 60 acres. And now that's for 1,256 students, but the new capacity would put us close to 1,500 students. Is something like that in the best interest of our students as the enrollment increases that would provide ample opportunity for them?
I guess one thing I'd like to make clear, that was not part of the recommendation.
Correct.
What was looked at was could there be an addition at the high school? Is it physically possible to put that in? And so that was kind of a footnote that when the high school reaches capacity, that would be an option. But that's really the extent of the discussion of the committee. Is that accurate? And so certainly, again, I expect further discussion on that.
Okay. And then, you know, when it comes to gross capacities, we currently operate the high school. The high school is the only school that we operate above the recommended gross capacity based on a square footage count. So what I'm trying to say is that both the high school site size and the available space, the capacity space, isn't adequate. So I understand that the long range facility committee may have recommended us to look at 4K to 8. But again, it was 3 years ago, and so to accept that as a scope of the task that was given to the facilities committee, I don't know if it really solves the issue, the grand scheme of things. You know, in the enrollment, the open enrollment. The other thing is so we have about $2.5 million, Jared, for projected open enrollment income this year. So open enrollment now is limited in the district. We're not accepting students 6 through 12. How are we going to replenish that revenue stream with a facility that's in the middle of all of our facilities? that now doesn't allow for open enrollment to flow from top to bottom.
So as we it's stated, once open enrollment, as residents grow, open enrollment will be limited.
There you go.
So how open enrollment and residents work is that our residents actually bring in $10,700 on average. However, it's a 3-year rolling average to get to a full. So when a new family moves into the district, we only get to count a third of their child until 3 years, and then we get that full 10,000. However, with open enrollment, we get it's getting close to $7,000. So right now, what we're doing is that $7,000 is quick money versus as residents come in, we're technically getting more money for resident students. However, it does take a couple of years to do that. So it's more budget planning for that. So as we know that we're going to be limiting, if we're going to anticipate those are going to be new students, we're going to take 3 years to get to that full amount.
Okay. So just so everyone's aware, this past school year, we denied 128 open enroll requests, which was about $900,000. The 2016 operations referendum, this is my last piece, is at a cost of $137 per thousand, per 100,000, I apologize. So if we're going to build a 3 to 5 and we've basically been told that a renewal is going to be necessary, the new school should take in consideration revenue opportunities and expense opportunities that would maybe prevent the need to now renew. We're just, with the plan, we're just accepting the fact that we're going to have to renew the operations referendum, and that's an expensive ticket. I mean, if people really understand the ramifications of another operations referendum that, we can't plan the future for state funding and federal funding, this could be an ongoing process. But if you build a facility that allows for income streams that we currently don't have and potential open enrollment opportunities throughout the district, you may then eliminate the need for a renewal of the operations referendum, which is at a cost to the taxpayers. In conclusion, sorry. I believe that the taxpayers deserve alternative options to be able to come to a conclusion for the best possible solution. The proposal needs to be tabled, we need to slow down, and a scope for all grade levels needs to be considered. We need to have a plan for 4K through 5, 6 through 8, and 9 through 12 before any more facilities are built. A solution with a term of at least 15 to 20 years needs to be proposed. A solution that explores revenue options to maintain our facilities. A solution that reduces expenses to prevent additional funds for operations from taxpayers. A solution that provides more opportunities for our students as the enrollment grows. And a solution that will stimulate the economic growth and diversify the tax burden. If the process of a referendum could take 2 to 4 years, that's what's stated, we could be back at this table upon completion of this new school and an operations referendum within 6 years, 6, 7 years. So I would just like, us to look at alternative options. Thank you.
My name is Ford Munn. I live in Monona. And unlike most of you in this room, I'm retired and on fixed income. My property taxes have doubled in the last 10 years because I went down and looked at it, okay? And you also don't know, because you don't live in Monona, but we have to spend probably $100 million in Monona, which you don't care about, and that's okay, on a new pool, a new public safety building, and probably a senior center, within the next 5 years. And all of those things have to be taken into account. I'm 71 years old. I'm a product of the school system. I went to Nichols School right here, and there were 30, I went back and looked at my 1957 yearbook. The average number of students per classroom was 33 in those days. The average today is 21, 22, something like that. We looked at all of this stuff. We looked at the projections of the high school. I know I got into a discussion with somebody from Cottage Grove at one of our meetings, and if there was a need for a high school, I'd be 100% in favor of building it in Cottage Grove. That's where it ought to be. We don't have a need for a high school for 10 to 20 years. And the last comment I would, you've got to keep in mind that half the voting population is still in Monona. And a big chunk of that is on fixed income. And those are big numbers that we start throwing out there that may not be needed. And the reason I know that is I'm on the board of directors of the YMCA, or I was. And I was the only one to vote down the building a new Y in Sun Prairie. And there were a variety of reasons for that, but they went ahead because they had the land given to them, they had $1 million given to them, and so on and so forth. Shortly after they built it, the recession hit, and the homes built in Sun Prairie dried up. And that Y has been that building has been a financial struggle on the entire association since it was built in 1999. There were 17 new homes built in Cottage Grove last year, 2017. I know you think that there's a lot of them, but there hasn't been necessarily. And I'm just going to warn all of you, if you go back with too much money, you're not going to get a lot of votes out of Monona or probably the township of Cottage Grove. You will in the village, but not the township. And just be smart about it. Let's get it done. The problem is fifth graders. If we move the fifth graders, my original plan was we ought to bus them here to this building. But if we get the fifth graders out of Glacier Drumlin, there's enough room in Glacier Drumlin for what, 10 to 15 years or more? I know there's a big number just by moving the fifth graders out. Okay, and that really should be the solution and the problem. But you've got to think about the money, because half the votes are still here. More than half. And the tax base is here. Okay? They won't let you split the district. Understand that. The State Department of Public Instruction wants fewer school districts, not more of them. They're not going to let that happen. And it can't be. You couldn't afford it anyway, to pay for these schools and buy new ones. So just be smart on your thinking. That's all that I'm asking. If in fact there's a need at the high school for a new high school, it ought to be built in Cottage Grove, and I would support it 100%. But for the next 10 to 20 years, I don't think there's that need. So,
okay. Thank you.
Yes.
If I could, I just want to talk about open enrollment for a second and about the revenue associated with that. Yes, first of all, yes, it brings in $900,000, but we spend a good chunk of that on the students that we're bringing in. The other thing is, it's not a loss. When we open up our spaces to open enrollment students, when we deny a student, it's because we have grown our resident students to fill that space. That actually improves our bottom line over having a resident student in there instead of an open enrollment student. The other thing about building capacity for an open enrollment student is that this new elementary school we're talking about is something like $75,000 per student, which goes on the tax basis. If we're building spaces for open enrollment students, we're asking our taxpayers to pay $75,000 for a student that brings in $7,000 a year, because they won't be contributing to the cost of the construction. So it's not as simple as the revenue stream, as looking at the revenue streams of $900,000 in here. Yeah, we'd love to have, whenever we have a space, we love to fill it with an open enrollment student because having $7,000 is better than not. But creating spaces for those students or adding classrooms for those students, the economics starts to get a lot less positive for the school district when we do that.
Hi, Joey. I'm a Miller again. Like Randy, my children went to the school here with 33 students. But education is different. And that was a lot of what we looked at in part of the committee, the learning environment, who lives in our community, how do we teach them? And Monona Grove, for the 40 years I've lived here, has had one of the best educational systems in our community within Dane County. Yes, it cost us as Monona and Cottage Grove taxpayers to have that quality education. And that's really one of the issues that Patty talked about, is that how do we give that education to our students along with some of the sports and some of the other thing. And one of the options that we chose in our school districts for a long time is that we share some of those resources. Within the city of Monona Grove, we asked them to build up sport fields. Why? Because we knew the school district needed. How do we use the other buildings as best as we can while they're still usable? Cottage Grove did the same thing with softball fields and soccer fields. Is it the best idea? Is it like Oregon's track? Is it like Verona? No. But we have to live with and make those decisions all the time. I have to make the decision with my own home, just like you do. Where we choose to live is for the quality of life, and it's for the quality of education. Because if we do not educate our children well, and we do not give them the ability to understand that they are precious to us for whatever way you want to do it, they are protected in our schools, they are treated with respect, which is far more than other school districts in our community. You know, we are very, very blessed to be able to do that, but we have to be responsible at that, and I would agree. We're not going to go to a 30 size or 33 student classroom. We made that decision a long time ago to have low classroom sizes because the data showed us it was much better education, and that's the bottom line.
We have a couple of questions from the YouTube and Facebook Live. I'm just going to read them verbatim. Is it true that the district is looking to purchase more acreage near GDS on top of what they just bought?
We have looked at, ideally for long term, we would like to have more acreage, yes. And so I think it's fair to say that we have an interest in considering that.
Okay. It's easy to change the high school to a middle school, harder to change GDS to an elementary, but it can be done. So why not go that route now to prepare for the future rather than just put a Band-Aid on the immediate problem?
I think that question's already come up.
Okay. Last one, the high school number seems high. Sun Prairie is building 2 elementary schools for $90 million. That's just a comment.
Okay. A couple up here.
Hi, I'm Tracy. I'm from Cottage Grove, and I just have a couple, I guess, questions. Number one, in regards to the survey, none of the comments were made public. So just wondering if there was any plan to make those public. Number two, I kind of consider myself educated and did not know anything about any of this until that initial survey came out. So in regards to looking at things with your comment, Joe, I would consider myself educated and was not aware of any of that. And I feel like given the amount of people that are trying to spread the word, that is a theme in Cottage Grove, at least. I can't speak for Monona. But if that's the case and your survey gave you 20% of the results off of people that maybe didn't even know this was going on, I just would think maybe we could take some time and send out another survey because you might get very different results given the knowledge base and what has been going around. And I don't know if that's an option before August. I really don't know the answer to that. The other thing would be, could you send out a different survey saying, here is what we're looking at, long-term, short-term, and look at those survey results. And I think consensus is, we know that there's an ongoing need based on the elementary stuff, but do we need to rush it for the fall? Or is this something that we could wait on until the spring and sit back and actually evaluate things and not rush it through? Because I don't think I think everyone wants what's in the best interest for our kids, and we're all willing to spend some money, but we're still not done with the 2016 referendum. Then we're gonna add an operational and another. I mean, I think the concern is the ongoing tax burden and not having a long-term solution. And even if we are in that 10-year range plan for a high school, by the time that comes up, we're still gonna be paying for this elementary, and then you're gonna go back and have to ask for another referendum. So I don't think we're ever gonna get out of that referendum phase if we don't come up with a long-term solution. And I think what people are saying is, can we just slow the process down and delay, if there is that 2-year time limit that the board can go and ask for that, would it be better just to have just take some time on it? Versus because at this point, honestly, the people that I've talked to, I don't even know if this would pass. The 52, your survey results was before people kind of even had an awareness. If that gets turned down and voted no, then am I right that you have to wait 2 years to go through and pass another referendum? 18 months. So if we wait 6 months and try to get it right, and what the majority of the public would know would be better than waiting 18 months. And I know we're overcrowded, and this isn't always a great idea, but my kids also were in trailers at Taylor Prairie for several years to accommodate overcrowding. And I know it's not ideal, but that is an option that can also be looked at if you're looking at a short-term process to get a long-term solution.
Okay, a number of things, and I'll certainly someone to respond. Just a couple of the technical questions at the beginning with regard to the survey. And that was something that we recognized, that despite our efforts to try to get information out publicly, that for many people, this really would be the first time that they saw this information. So that was part of the challenge, and the design of the survey was to try to have it as an information tool as well, besides the questions. Whether we succeeded at that, but that was the goal, with the survey. But everything else that you mentioned, I think, are certainly the type of things that the board will discuss. But I think we have someone like to respond.
I think one has to also look at the historical background of why school districts are where they are, not just in Monona, but throughout, is there are caps on school budgets and things like that are not sufficient to do the operations, not to be able to build the facilities and things like that. We have to look at how and why these caps are there. How do we get rid of them? What do we look at? It's a whole variety of things. And while the FAC did not want to look at the politics of it, but we had to go forward to say, what are some of the options? And I will tell you personally, I was one of those to say, are we getting the message out to the community? And I recognize that not everybody, maybe not even a majority, were really aware and looking at things on the website, but I don't know how you can do it to be able to say everybody is looking at it, everybody is doing it. Within the school district I was most familiar with at Winnequa was that as a responsible person on the committee, I would talk it up. I would ask them, are you aware this is happening? What do you think about Winnequa? Do you think it's okay? Other than the fact that it's pretty old and the windows during wintertime leaked and it was very cold and you'd see kids with coats on. But, you know, to put it off, we talked about that as to when is the best thing. What happens to those other projects that we have been putting off and putting off? Will there be a disaster before the boilers break or the roof leaks? So those were some of the priorities and the issues that the FAC really looked at and said, what can we do? And how can we do it as responsibly as we can? So that's my thing.
I just want to add one side comment, because we have a very obviously passionate and vocal group from Cottage Grove that's in support of spending a lot of money. I want to echo Randy's comment. I think he left, but about being fiscally responsible in the decision too, just because we're not hearing it tonight, so I think it's easy to go out and say everybody wants this, but in the listening sessions we had, and a lot of the other feedback we got, just so the group's aware, there is a huge percentage of people that don't want to spend 2 cents on this project. So as a committee, we did, hear from both sides, even though one side is obviously much more vocal here tonight. That other group exists, and so there is a huge population in Monona, particularly, that's very hesitant to spend money. So we have to make sure that we're very responsible with the recommendation that we make going forward.
Hello, my name is Peter Sandin. I think I introduced earlier, I'm with Findorf. What we have done throughout the process is help to inform the district where the costs might come in for the different options. And so I wanted to address something quick, some of the questions regarding cost, and then Dan had an answer for your question, Ryan, about the perceived error between the 1190 and the 960. So with regards to cost, there was a question regarding the 2 elementary schools in Sun Prairie, which we are building and help them through the referendum process, as well as Verona, which we're working with them too. So when we put costs together for something like a high school, and I know it feels first blush to seem a little bit high, but we take into account all the schools we're building in the district, in the Dane County. We're working in, I think it's 16 different school districts right now, building different high schools and elementary schools. And a key thought is that high schools have a lot more spaces that elementary schools don't have. Theaters cost more money than a special ed room. Pools cost more money. Gym and equipment spaces cost more money. Labs are more dollars that contribute to the budget being higher. And then also with that high school, you have the athletic fields and the sites. I mean, my kids are all elementary school age, and you go there and it's like there's a sidewalk and a playground that's $150,000, and there's a school with a bunch of classrooms. And the amount of, I don't want to use the word amenities, but the amount of extra things that are required for a high school really do drive the price up. So while it seems like a high number, it is very conservative considering all the other districts we're building. It is very much on par with what they're building in Verona, so that $110 million number would be very similar, but with a different amount of students. Obviously, they have more high school students. So that's kind of the background of how the costs go into creating a high school. And then Dan wanted to mention something about the projections.
I was just going to say concerning the one published version where the numbers did not appear to be averaged at the bottom. So there was 2 versions of the table, one that had resident students only and one that had a combination of resident and open enrollment students. And when we first gave these numbers to the facility committee back last October, I think one that had the combination of open enrollment and resident students, the number had not been averaged on the bottom. Within like a week or 2, that was noticed, and the numbers were resent to the facility committee and other consultants. So if there's a version of it that was floating around, that was not around for long, at least in terms of what the...
and I can show people after the survey that went out to the public had only the low end for the middle school. The rest of them were the average. So that's not a mistake that's on your end, but the creation of the survey had one number being used from a different basis than the others.
Okay.
Thank you.
I'm maybe coming from a little bit of a different avenue in my questions. I think it's more related to one of the comments in the referendum was improving the learning environments. So I have a couple questions there. One, how are we improving the learning environments for the kids? Second, oftentimes I've seen in the district that I work in that a new school gets built and there's a lot of money that gets put into new technology. And then the existing buildings are lacking, you know, years behind that. So do I worry about Winnequa being years behind the technology at the new school? Absolutely. So I'd like if you can answer that. My other question is, this is a question. I don't know, where is the allocation of money for curriculum? Because as I've talked to some of the people in the district about the curriculum and where we are with that, I have huge concerns. You know, you were talking about the excellence of education. And I look back to, you know, our district report card in Winnequa for student growth got fails to meet expectations. So as a parent and a teacher myself, that's really concerning. So I'm saying, where is the money for this curriculum that we honestly need to be putting money into, because we are, what I believe in working in other districts, behind where we need to be. So where does the funding for curriculum come? Because that seems to be my biggest thing right now. So if you can answer any of those questions. Anybody?
Okay, I can answer the question. With regard to the curriculum, that goes back to the operational costs. And the operational referendum that was passed in 2016, that was absolutely an area of need. We had not had new science resources at the elementary for 12 years. And there are a number of other areas that we were shortcoming. So that was one of the budget areas that we were able to significantly increase due to that referendum. And that's still a work in process. And you're accurate that we're behind in our curriculum renewals, but we have a plan in place, and so with our current funding on operations, we'll feel that we're in a pretty good place that we're able to continue moving forward there.
I'm going to just do a real quick follow-up again, sorry. Relative to that number on the projections and the number in the survey would have included the 5th grade for Glacial Drumlin if it continues. So I'm not sure what your question was specifically, but that's kind of where those numbers came from. So,
yeah. The projections are, we were told we're all high-end, low-end average, okay? But that's not the case. When you look at them line by line, it's the low end for the middle school. So it was misleading when you talk about enrollment projections in the survey. That number doesn't match the low-end, high-end average.
right, because the numbers that we were using for, there's two different things we're talking about. We're talking about 6 through 8 and 5 through 8. So Glacial Drumlin right now is 5 through 8. When you pull 5th grade out, that changes that enrollment in that building. So that's where they get moved to the 3-5.
But the projection wasn't based on what the recommendation was. The projection was based on the grade levels as they currently exist.
If you look at the numbers, though, and you pull out the 5th grade, and then you look at 6, 7, and 8, those numbers do match the information that we've been publishing, along with, like I said, if you continue the 5th grade projection forward in Glacial Drumlin, that would match the number that was in the survey.
So I just want to address your first question. So I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name, or I forgot it. You asked about learning spaces. And so that question on the survey was referring to, the committee talked a lot about our existing facilities. So for example, Glacial Drumlin and some of those strange pod-like creatures that are there and being a bit underutilized, as well as other learning environments at Winnequa and some of our other schools. And so that really, in our recommendation, is falling into the renovations to existing schools category. So in terms of what specifically we're doing, the committee has sent that to the board in terms of allotting $8 to $11.2 million. And so they're gonna have to make the difficult choices about specifically how to do that. Peter's given me a stink eye on that. But recognizing that there is an opportunity in those, like Glacial Drumlin and all of our elementary schools, so that falls into that renovations category, and the specific choices are yet to be made.
What about the technology being
in the
equal
same
across schools?
In the same way, for many years, the school board, again, has to prioritize. And so over a variety of school boards and members on school boards. Where did technology come in their priorities versus some of the maintenance issues or some of the safety issues? Those are things that our committee has no purview over. That, again, those key questions you need to address to the school board members and to be able to, but we did ask that we try to get an educational learning system that was going to be as good as we could get within our budget priority parameters. You know.
There were some recommendations in that renovation bucket. For example, for science labs, we talked a lot about. So again, the technology is outside of the purview of facilities. Our discussion was just on actual facilities, not curriculum, not technology, just physical spaces.
I understand that. I was just trying to say, with a new school building being built and new technology goes into that building, will that technology in the new building be replicated in the old schools?
That'll come down to decisions that are yet to be made.
There's talk of students getting iPads, whatever they need.
Okay, I can answer it. Absolutely, the word equity has been in a lot of our conversations and will continue to be. And that's where a lot of the renovations that we talk about with the existing buildings to make sure they are equitable to any new, future buildings. With regard specifically to technology, we have not even begun to discuss about what might be in a new school, but I can't imagine they would have anything different in the new school that we don't have already in our existing schools. That was another huge boost for us in the operational referendum. A significant amount of funds went towards technology with that, again, to get that equity within the existing schools. So we are there right now with our schools.
Randy Hilgart from Cottage Grove. I have 3 kids in the school district, I think 1 in several different schools. I'll echo the comments of everybody here. I appreciate all the work that's gone in to date, and I'll plead ignorance on my own part trying to get myself educated, which has been a little bit hard to do with the information out there. So I'll make 2 quick comments and then a question. The first comment is a frustration on the survey. As someone with a little bit of experience in developing surveys, that survey had one option. If you really look at it, it had one basic option, and that was very frustrating and was painfully obvious to see that. We weren't presented with other options that had some disparity to building another grade 3 through 5 school. That was the option. And then it was breaking apart the other schools. That was it. So that was a frustration. My other comment is looking at things long term. My wife and I, before we had kids, we moved to the school district because of the reputation of the educational system in Monona Grove. It had a wonderful reputation. I believe if we don't make good decisions now, it's either a downward spiral or an upward spiral in terms of the reputation that our school district has. And people move to, I'm sure people will move to Verona or Oregon or here or wherever because of the reputation that that school district has. Educationally, athletics, you name it, it's all in there. So I think we got to make some very wise decisions long-term thinking, I think in terms of a spiral or overall trend. My question is, in any of this, as we've looked at facilities, have we looked at how to, now I understand there's a revenue side we could look at, but is there also a cost reduction side we could look at? We're looking at adding, by my math, we have either 6 or 7 facilities, 8 if you count the administrative offices. Is there a way to reduce the overall number of facilities, which should reduce overall number of operating costs? Fewer custodial staff, fewer building maintenance, all those types of costs that come year after year after year. I'd appreciate some look into how we can reduce cost ongoing.
I've been one for a long, long time, critically looking at cost and particularly administrative costs. So when I got on this committee, I looked at every referendum that passed within the Badger Conference, Sun Prairie, Oregon, Wanakee, DeForest, and I followed the tracking of the students. Who did they work with? Where did they get their information? And one of the things that came back out most recently is some of our administrative costs. Do we have too many administrators and principals in the building for the same number of schools? Well, I question that with Dan and others, and I will continue because I think, in addition, but one of the key things that you won't find in some of the other schools is class size. When my children were in Nichols, and my third grader was with 33 kids and a teacher, that the teacher could not even move around to see what was happening until she got to the end of the row. I said, this class is too big. And so we had a concerted effort for many school boards that we fought that class size. And with class size comes cost, because you have more teachers as you get more students in each class. But then we looked really closely at the quality of education. 10 years ago, I looked at what starting teachers were making. Why are we getting turnovers in our teachers, or what's happening with their teachers? You would have been shocked at starting salaries. And Jared will tell you, in the, I think, 8 years, we've improved those starting salaries. So we're getting better teachers, younger teachers, but better teachers coming in. Those are some of the things that we, as taxpayers, at the annual meeting, need to come and ask the school board. I asked the school board because I found out that every student was getting a towel, and the towel fee was X number of dollars. My children never received a towel all of their life in school. And I asked where they went to. The football team. Well, the football team and the boosters better start paying for my kids' towels. And we began to question all of these kinds of things. You have that right, and you should be looking at it just like this. Because we made the recommendation doesn't mean the school board's going to take it exactly as we gave it. They may change it, they may lower it, they may raise it. This is your opportunity. It's now in the school board's hands. You look at those school board members, because even the administration does not make the decision if we go to referendum, at what cost do we go to the referendum. We've elected these officials, give them the time to review it, make sure you reviewed it, and then ask the questions, because that's the next step. That's the next step. They have to either make the decision by August if we're going to referendum, because if you don't make that decision by August, right, it can't be put on a referendum. There's not enough time. So the timeline and the next steps for all of us are right now.
I have a quick question. My name is Brian Ullman. This is for the people who conducted the surveys. When you guys are looking at building an elementary or a high school and the needs, do you ever look at the financial impacts of what that could do for a community, and what type of revenue could come out of if you could hold WIA events? Or is it strictly based on the enrollment projections?
Okay. Well,
I know the budget is a big concern for people, but you know, if we're gonna do this and we only have 57 million, I know Randy said his piece and dropped the mic and walked away, but regardless, either way, the taxes are gonna go up. You know, what is the taxes gonna be if we did go to 120 million and 157? What is that on a monthly basis? You know, compared to the house. I think that's the information that, when you talked earlier about educating the people and really getting the right facts to them, that's what we need, because regardless, there's a lot of needs here, but we have to look at the overall financial impact of what a school can do for the community, what it can do for, you know, just the growth of the school district long term. And I think if we put a Band-Aid on it, like you said earlier, this could really go downhill for MG, and we don't want to see that, and that's why we're here so supporting just getting other information, because we care about it.
Hi. Again, thank everybody for their time and coming out. I'm Kyle Brum from Cottage Grove. Just listening to everybody here tonight, kind of summing it up, it seems like we have needs and we want smart spending. And I think ultimately we're basing this off of the EAU report and the other experts inside of that report. And I would ask, how come we can't get a list of priority from a third party like that of I think I counted 92 recommendations inside that report of what's priority and what's not, and that way we have a document we can reference as a whole, take the pressure off the FAC, take the pressure off the school board, take the pressure off everybody, and point to that document and say, hey, this is what they came up with as #1 priority for Monona Grove School District.
Just to let everybody know, the survey company was School Perceptions. We're representing Epstein Union Architects and Findorf, so the survey company is not here. Just to make that clear. Going back to the question, so are you referring back to the original facility study? So that facility study basically goes through and identifies deficiencies within the district relative to what the capacities of the buildings are, the educational adequacy, and then also the physical makeup of the building, if you will, the components within the building, HVAC, electrical, mechanical. We've got consultants that walk through and look at that. We give that information to the district, and they're the ones that really are the ones that have to go through and prioritize what is important to them. That's really us giving them unbiased information related to the building and how it's working, and having the district analyze what's important to them and what they should address. Typically, we're not providing that information. We're not saying you should do these things. That's entirely up, and really that's part of the process. And that's the process that the district has gone through over the last really 3 to 4 years in coming up with what are those priorities and what they should be addressing. We're there to support them in providing additional information as needed, but it's really giving them base information. It's really providing that base level knowledge for them to build decisions off of.
Thank you. Yep, and I understand that. It's just there seems to be a slight break in the chain, I guess, from that point to the FAC on how we came up with $14.8 million for outdoor athletics and going down to $645,000 on how the priority broke down. And it's just a lot of pressure on the FAC to come up with those priorities as 20 residents.
So I can speak to how we narrowed this list. So as a committee, we did look at both the responsiveness on the survey in terms of what the community felt was most important, and then we prioritized them and laid them in order. So again, we felt that the school was most important, so we put that first, and we decided that's going to be $30 to $33.5 million. So now we've got $27 million left. Okay, what did we recommend to the school board they do with $27 million? We felt the capital maintenance, there was nothing on there that we were comfortable taking off. Because again, you can't continue to defer that, or roofs will start caving in or whatnot. So the only difference between the before survey and after survey on the capital maintenance, Maywood. So at the time before we conducted the survey, there were some questions about what we would do with the Maywood property, and through the course of the survey, some things happened, leases were renewed, we were able to defer that, everything else we carried forward. We then had the 2 buckets for outdoor athletics and high priority renovation. So the survey data and the community very strongly supported security. Obviously, we want our students to be safe and secure, as well as high priority renovations. Now those are both bucket areas. But as we looked at renovations like a secure entrance at Winnequa, that was a really important area. So that's how those started coming back. And at the end of the day, what the survey data told us, I feel like I'm cutting out here, the survey data told us that of all of the things that we asked about, the lowest amount of support came back in favor of athletics. So that's where we took a look and said, okay, if we had to prioritize athletics, what do we want to recommend to the school board to consider? And that's where we came back with the track because it's almost unusable at the current point. So that's how we went through it. We prioritized it. We figured out how much money we needed and gave these buckets. There's still a lot of flex room for the board to make choices as they dig into that detail deeper, but that's how we got to that secondary recommendation. You know, that outdoor athletics bucket at 14.8 had a lot of needs. You know, we really think the soccer stadium would have been awesome, but it had a lot of wish list items there too, as well as athletics fields at the new school site that the community didn't show a high level of support for. And at the end of the day, when something had to come off of the list, that was the thing with the lowest priority based on what our community told us they would be willing to pay for.
So kind of a follow-up to that. Since I guess I'm just kind of recognizing maybe this Monona Cottage Grove difference of getting involved in awareness or whatever, do we have survey results divided by, can we see?
I want to take 1 second to defend the survey. I thought survey guy was here, but he's not. Okay, I don't have the survey data in front of me, but I do want to take a moment to defend the survey because, like you, I work in a profession where I rely on survey data heavily to do my job. I work in marketing. I use marketing research all the time. So I came looking at the survey data with a very critical eye in terms of how it was conducted. Was the sample size appropriate? What was the statistical significance? What was the margin of error? As we went through these topics, the gentleman from School Perceptions gave me a very high level of confidence that in terms of how the survey was conducted. Now, the specific questions in terms of we should have asked that instead of that, that's not on School Perceptions, but how the survey questions were worded, the quality of the data is good. We asked a lot of questions. That meeting got a little sideways. I'm going to tell you, I think I might have spoken up because the meeting got sideways. The survey data was good. I'm happy offline to talk to you about it. I can bring it. We can meet for coffee sometime. I'm happy to talk to you about that. But yes, we looked at the data from Cottage Grove residents, from Monona residents, from parents, from non-parents, from teachers within the district, teachers out of the district. We asked for crosstabs. We received crosstabs. All of that was considered. And again, being someone who works a lot with market research data, the data is good. And the other interesting thing, and again, I don't have the numbers in front of me, so I'm going to paraphrase, so don't quote me on this if I don't get it right. But it was really interesting. So a lot of people talk about that $57 million number. And how did we get to that $57 million number? Well, the gentleman that presented it, like our other consultants, works heavily in schools. They conduct all these research studies for schools. The year before, again, paraphrasing, do not hold me to these numbers, but the idea is the same. They did something like 26? They did something like 26 surveys in the previous year. Of those 26 surveys, the data came back in 21 instances and said, your community will support referendum at this dollar amount. So they recommended in those 21 instances that people move forward. All 21 of those passed. 5 instances came back and said, your community will not support referendum. Those communities went to referendum. Those referendums did not pass. One referendum or one situation came back where the School Perceptions recommended they go to referendum at $25 million. But the school board got sassy and said, we're going to go for 26.9, and it failed. So when we look at the quality of the data is good based on the moment in time in which it was taken. So again, we did look at crosstabs, we looked at different use cases, we looked at different populations. I learned a lot about how we should survey different populations in terms of, the parents skew very differently than non-parents, and actually non-parents are a much larger part of the community, and so you have to give them a different weight. Again, we could spend hours. We had a 2-hour meeting going over just that, but the data is good.
Hi, my name is Angela Brantner. I'm Cottage Grove address. And I'm wanting to know if, or I would request of the school board members, if the data is really truly good, would they be interested or could they please have a new survey that includes not just K through 8, but also the whole long range K through 12. I guess that's one thing that I would ask of the school board members, please.
Patty, just in regards to your comment, I don't think the question is whether the data was good, and I respect.
I understand, like you're asking about what questions.
Yeah. And so part of the creation of the survey didn't involve you as committee members.
No, that was chartered by the school board.
Sure. So that's kind of our concern, is that the people putting the recommendation together weren't part of the survey.
However, Ryan,
Yeah.
Correct. We didn't have any role in creating the survey. However, the survey was based off of the initial preliminary recommendation that we provided. So there was still many, many hours of work and discussion that guided that preliminary recommendation that the board then used to guide the survey tool itself.
Okay. So then, in regards to the presentation tonight made it appear that the operations portion is part of this recommendation, okay? Which it's actually not. The facilities committee has decided not to recommend an operations portion. Now, when I'm working with a homeowner, what we do first, the very first process is to pre-approve someone, okay? So we are now in the position to put our school board members, 7 members, in a position to decide on an operations portion that wasn't recommended by the facilities committee. Why was an operations portion not part of this package?
So very basically, we discussed the operational referendum extensively at the committee. However, it did not make it into the final recommendation, understanding that it would be needed. But again, we are a facilities advisory committee. Operations is operations, and we didn't have the exact dollar amount. And so we knew and actually told them they would need to consider an operational referendum. But because it's not actually facilities, we had to punt that over to the board.
And again, you have to remember, when you go to referendum on a facilities, it's a 2-part question. You have to have an operation statement.
That's actually not true, because we can go to an operations referendum and work within the facility, the current budget of the school district.
Correct.
And that would entail budget cuts.
Correct, that's true.
So the facilities committee doesn't provide a recommendation, which in the presentation at the one I went to, there was a recommendation in there of an operation cost to run this facility. So I guess what I'm saying is we're willing to build a facility and not recommend the operations portion, and now we're going to leave that to the school board. Is that I mean, that's really what's happening to make
No. What Jared provided was that if the school board chooses to put that operational, how much would it cost? And that was what was put into the survey as well, to say, understand, if you have a facility, there are operational costs from that. And at the current operational referendum or operational budget, those dollars are not included in the current.
Okay, so strictly facilities was the recommendation that you were focused on.
That's all we were asked in charge with. So.
And just a consideration of that. So a lot of choices that are going to be made in how, let's say we do go to referendum, we go to school, again, just playing hypothetical here. If they build a school, there are a lot of different choices that would be made throughout that process that will significantly impact what that operational referendum would be. For example, we've discussed a 9-section school with 3 grades. We've discussed a 10-section for 3 grades. Those are 2 very different things in terms of how much it costs to heat and cool. And so the issue is, until those decisions are made, the exact amount of the operational referendum is very difficult to come at. And so for here, I believe it was provided, Jared, for informational purposes in terms of this is a most likely scenario. We want to make sure that we're giving you an idea of the full costs associated with the proposal, but knowing that between now and any decision, that would change based on subsequent decisions being made.
That makes sense. Thank you. My last question for the evening is, so the track was a identified priority as part of the recommendation. We had 0 track meets this year at Monona Grove, from what I understand. I discussed this with Dan, and the possibility of a turf facility, of on-site turf facility at the high school would accommodate more students, whether they play soccer, football. You can host baseball practice as an infield. Softball, we could use that in the spring when it's too muddy out. So what I'm suggesting is as part of this athletic portion is we can really look at maximizing our usage by potentially allocate. And if you do the track, you almost got to do the playing surface, because it's all about the movement of water. I don't know if you guys can talk about that, and I don't know if it's that important. But essentially, by just choosing the track, because I don't even know how 8 years ago we had to do the track again. Yeah. So all I'm saying is I don't know if that's a more of a long-term solution that will also affect more students that we can look at potentially including. And this isn't really a question, just a suggestion.
Again, going back to track, with the recommendation from Shiner and Dan, track is the most participating sport of any at the high school. The number of students and things like that to be able, and that was a consideration. So what did it mean for them to currently run on their current track? And when we found out that they can run it safely as long as you use 7 lanes, okay? But then the 8th lane is really the issue. Can it be resurfaced? Because our kids, and my kids went to school with you, Ryan. How many times that track has been resurfaced and built? It is no longer a possibility. It must be totally torn down and rebuilt to be able to utilize it the way it needs to do going forward. So that was a priority that we looked at and we had to consider. And that's why it came up at this. It also was one that could solve a lot of issues and benefit a lot of students at a reasonable cost. Jason.
Yeah, just a couple of things as we go through this. The track, it's roughly $200,000 a year to repair it. And so rebuilding it makes more sense in the long run, fiscally responsibility again. You asked a little bit about the scope of, or the survey and the operating referendum. The charge for the FAC didn't include the operating referendum. It was strictly about the facilities. Now, as the 3 of us and some others presented all along to the board at different points, we talked about the things that they were going to have to address. The operating referendum, the grade configuration, whether you do boundary lines, all of those other things that have been discussed tonight. They were points of emphasis that we made because that wasn't what we were charged with doing. It's whether we recommend a building and or the capital maintenance that goes with those buildings.
And that makes sense. Just the concern that I have is that it's a permanent, the operations portion is a permanent cost.
Correct.
So once we erect this building, that's a permanent cost to the district. Just like we have all of these other buildings that are unused within the district.
As we finalized our recommendation, we did talk a little bit about the fact that the exact point you made is that the building could pass, but the operating referendum could not. And then what happens? That's the board's issue and worries.
Paula Severson, Cottage Grove. I have 2 questions. First is, have there been conversations between the school board and the major municipalities, the city of Monona, village and town of Cottage Grove, in terms of what their plans are for residential growth? And in particular, right now the village of Cottage Grove is planning 3 new TIF districts, which is going to basically pull those off the tax rolls. So I don't know if we've projected what that could do to the school district. So I want to know if there's been meetings or if there can be. I will relate, prior to moving to Cottage Grove, I lived in Sun Prairie and was on the Sun Prairie City Council. And I learned a very tough lesson in the early 2000s that approving development after development has repercussions. When I got a call from a school board member one day, what are you guys doing? We can't keep up. And it was a very tough lesson for me to learn as a 20-something-year-old that my decisions are not just affecting, you know, people coming in, but it's also affecting the school district. So if we haven't been meeting, I would encourage that. I'd love to see those take place even before some decisions are made. So that's one question. And then the second question, probably to Dan, is can you tell us a little bit more about what the workshop tomorrow night is with the school board and what is intended with that? Thank you.
Great questions. So first of all, with regard to communication with our communities, not only Village of Cottage Grove, but the town as well as the city of Monona, Jared and I are in regular communications with with Matt, and Aaron at the village, and as needed, with Jack Hendrich as the village president. So we're well aware of all the planning that is happening, within the village, as well as we have those same communications with the city of Monona, and then we certainly make sure we pass that information along to the board, as well as it impacts the work that we're doing. With regard to tomorrow night, okay, great question. Where do we go, from here to? So tomorrow night the board has a workshop. Okay, so there won't be any action taken. It's an opportunity for them to have a dedicated time where there's no other board agenda items to strictly look at all of the facilities information that they've been presented over this past time. Certainly a follow-up from tonight's meeting as well. I'm sure there'll be plenty of discussion with regard to the feedback they've heard here as well. And so it's a chance to kind of go through every one of the items that are before them from the recommendation, to share, make sure that they have all their questions answered. They fully understand the recommendations and rationale, which I think they're already in that place, but then an opportunity for them to discuss among themselves as well, their thoughts about that. And so that, if there are some items that they might reach consensus that will help perhaps moving forward in their formal discussions at the board level. Eventually at regular board meetings is where they'll have to actually take action on decisions. So tomorrow night's workshop is discussion and learning and an opportunity to talk to each other. It is a public meeting, but it'll be a discussion amongst the board members.
Just wanted to answer Brian's question about looking with the survey. So the purpose of the survey was just to find out what we had here. But as a school district, we do not look at necessarily right or wrong if building a school in Cottage Grove versus Monona is more economic development positive for Cottage Grove or Monona. What we're truly looking on is where our students are at and how we're going to best serve our students. So, that was part of the reason why a 3-5 was chosen for Cottage Grove. Obviously, you understand that there is some economic development opportunities for Cottage Grove if a high school went there, but that's not the decision-making process that we went through as administration or FAC. When we look at taking what we proposed tonight about a high school, along with the $14.8 million and trying to keep it consistent, our mill rate would be $1.57 per thousand compared to the 29 cents. So we would go from approximately for a $300,000 house from $87 up to approximately $471. So that, just to answer your question, obviously there's a lot more that has to be vetted out, but those are just numbers that we were able to get for you right away. And then to Paula's question, I serve on the CDA for the Village of Cottage Grove. In addition to us changing the method that we looked at our enrollment, before we always worked with APL with UW, which was just a mathematical equation of looking at birth rates, move-in migration. Vanderwall, along with myself, we met with each of the municipalities to talk about what their growth was. So some of those 3 or 4 subdivisions. What does become a challenge is when we do have community members that show up in villages and try to stop some of those subdivisions, and so that does throw off some of our enrollment. So when we see that in the Village of Cottage Grove, when we met with a group of people in the Village of Cottage Grove, there was an individual there that it really encouraged it as a school district that we should be reaching out to the municipalities and telling them this is the type of growth we want to see, and that's not really the role of a school district. We're going to accommodate every student that comes in our door. However, we want everybody to be aware of is that we are meeting with the municipalities. So we are trying to plan for those. And obviously as realtors and developers, you understand that it's a long process. It just doesn't happen overnight. So we do try to stay ahead. But the other part of it is, you know, we have heard that, you know, we are one of the higher mill rates in the state, and that is correct. We are about the 9th highest mill rate. But when you look at our commercial values, we have a large commercial value property valuation in the city of Monona, but we don't necessarily have that in Cottage Grove. And part of that, you know, creating those 3 TID districts and locking in that initial property is hopefully that will encourage some commercial growth. Obviously, we're not going to see that as a school district to lower our mill rates for at least 20 years or more. But ultimately, what we want to do is see growth. If we want our mill rates to decrease and be able to do that, we need new properties, new valuations, not reassessments.
I think we should wrap up this portion soon, but I want to make sure we take any, you know, final questions. And I also just want to remind you that when we do wrap up, we'll definitely stick around for individual conversations. But so please go ahead. Thanks.
For Jared, are there options besides 20-year bonds? Can you do like a 25 bond? What, 25 years for bonds or 30 years? 20 is the max. That's all I have. Thank you.
Also on the FAC, we had members from our different communities who were public officials who shared what their, also people who served on key development boards and what was happening. So those of us who were not, you know, part of that elected or the development process, we heard from those members that were also on our committee. It was very helpful to be able to think of what's coming down the line for of us in Monona, as Randy said. You know, like, when is this new property going to come up? We have things with the county. We have the things with our community colleges. These were all issues that, well, in itself, to say, well, what's $87? And if you add 87 to 127 for the community college and for this from the state, your property bill did go up $500 and some odd dollars that year or whatever. So but before we can make a decision, we thought it was important to know what was happening in each community, because that could skew what we would recommend or not recommend. But we certainly heard from those public officials what was happening in those communities.
Great, thank you. So are we okay at, well, I'm sorry, we do have another question.
I just wanted to say a couple things. First of all, I know that some of the people that were not able to come tonight, I'm missing my daughter's softball game tonight, which I'm on the road a lot, so that means that's a big deal to me that I'm missing it. But I know that some people that weren't able to make it wrote emails, and I don't know if they wrote it to you or to the school board or to whom, but just to make you all aware that there are emails out there from people who could not make it. And I think the gentleman from Monona that stood up, did he leave maybe? He, first of all, I appreciated his comments, and he was not incorrect. Mostly, he's not incorrect in saying Monona votes. Cottage Grove doesn't. So there is our action plan, people. Cottage Grove, head out to the polls. Just a thought.
Thank you. Okay, are there any other final questions before the large group? Yes.
What the long-term plan is for the Maywood School?
Sure. So Maywood, we just renewed another 5-year lease with Madison School District where they house their charter school in Westermundo. And so for the next 5 years, we have a lease agreement.
you know, that we did look at even Maywood. There's a lot of us that said, it's a building, what can we use it for? It's ours. We also said, don't sell it. You know, because at some point, we may need it. Maybe we'll give it to the city for a community center. Who knows?
Okay, so I think we'd like to wrap up. First of all, thank you so much for spending time with us tonight. As we know, I mean, when we talk about facilities referendum, these are really community decisions. And so these are not easy decisions, and every input is valued and needed. And so as you leave, we do have surveys we'd like you to fill out. They're very short, just a couple questions. So if you think they're being handed out now, if you'd please take just a moment or two to fill that out before you leave as well. And again, I'd like to remind you that we'll stick around as long as anyone would like to stay to make sure all your questions or comments are heard as well before you leave tonight. So again, thank you so much. And even though at this point we don't have another formal community session scheduled, informally, please keep the lines of communication open with us. Our board members, our administration definitely want to hear from you. Thank you.